Okay, today we are going to go through a relatively short PowerPoint. I know most of my stuff's like multiple days, but I think we're going to get through just today if I move fast enough. Over the Russian Revolution, something we mentioned, is related to World War I. It's going on during the war and a little bit after, but it is going to have ramifications moving forward. Talk about Russia a decent amount for the remainder of the class. This is how Russia transfers over into being the communist Soviet Union. So you kind of got to understand why they did that to really have a good appreciation for everything else that we're going to talk. Your chief goal today through this PowerPoint is to create a cause and effect chart, okay? I have it here in the form of a multi-flow map. It doesn't have to look exactly like that, but if you wanted to, that is perfectly fine, because a multi-flow map is essentially just a fancy cause and effect chart, where you put causes on one side, effects on the other, and then the Russian Revolution in 1917 in the middle. Really, most of the notes that you're going to take, yeah, pretty much all of them, you could some way shape into this sort of format, into this cause and effect chart. So as we're going through it, the first part obviously is going to be causes all the way until we get up to the Russian Revolution. And then once the revolution's kind of wrapped up or going on, you can transfer everything over into effects. This is going to be the second to last thing you need for Friday's notebook check. So again, pay attention, take some good notes. You should be in pretty good shape. Tomorrow, we are going to do a little bit of book work. But like I said yesterday, you kind of have some options tomorrow. You can either do the book work in class and do the DBQ for homework. Remember, the DBQ essay is due on Thursday before midnight. Or you can do the DBQ in class and do the book work for homework. That's entirely up to you. Just keep in mind, the DBQ does have a 60-minute time limit. And obviously, if you're doing it in class, unless you get here a little bit early, you'll probably only have 50 minutes. So I leave that up to you. You do whatever works best for you. On Thursday's going to be a pretty easy day. I've got one or two short video clips that we'll pause, we'll discuss, that go along with the bookwork assignment. If we have extra time, you can work on your bookwork, you can work on your notebook, you can kind of do whatever you need to do. And then on Friday, it's essentially a catch-up day. We are going to have a half day. You're only going to be in here, I think, 25 minutes, so it's not really a whole lot of time to get into anything new. So use that time to kind of solidify and submit your notebook, because notebook check number 1 is due before midnight on Friday. So the goal is today, causes, effects of the Russian Revolution. We'll get through the PowerPoint, and if time permits, I've got a pretty good video at the end that I think will go into a little bit more detail. So here we go, Russian Revolution. Now, when we say the Russian Revolution, we're actually talking about two separate revolutions that happened in the same year. You've got the February Revolution, where the Tsar, the ultimate leader of Russia, is kind of deposed. Then later that year, in October, that's when the communists take over. We're just going to call it all the Russian Revolution, but do know it kind of comes in two separate phases. Now, to understand why this is all going down, we got to go back and talk a little bit about Russia and its history itself. We've talked about Russia before. The last time was getting ready for the Peter the Great DBQ, the first DBQ essay we wrote. And we kind of talked about the origins of Russia, how they started off as a group of city-states. The Mongols come, take them over, rule over them through a sort of tributary relationship. They eventually unite, they defeat the Mongols, they become the Russian Empire, and years later, this is where we are. Throughout all that time, you've got the rule of the czars, essentially these all-powerful emperors who claim divine right, and really that's leading us into the 20th century. This story is kind of how that czar-led Russia comes to an end. So one of the most important consequences of World War I was the Russian Revolution of 1917. To understand the causes of this revolution, we must review a little of Russia's history and the developments that took place in Russia leading up to World War I. Here are some of the czars that we've talked about before. You did a little flow map back in the day about each one of these. You know, it starts with Ivan the Great. Later, and this isn't in order. I mean, it is in order, but there's some czars we're skipping. We talked about Ivan the Terrible. We talked about Peter the Great. We also closed off with Catherine the Great. We watched that Engineering an Empire episode to kind of talk about, you know, the rule of these czars and what Russia was like. For most of its history, and really when we look at the Russian Empire history, we're usually saying 1547 to 1917, when, you know, 1547 it officially becomes an empire. The Russian Empire was ruled by czars, and we've talked about that before. Sometimes you will see czar spelled with a T instead, but it's the same thing. It's a play on Caesar. Essentially, it's the equivalent of an emperor. Russia's czars were autocrats, rulers with unlimited power. And just to clarify, the stuff in gold, you could probably put that on the causes side. I mean, you know, having these sort of autocratic rulers, which again, one of the many words for rulers that can do whatever they want. I mean, that was certainly something that strained the relationship with the people over, you know, literally hundreds of years. Again, an autocrat, it's just an absolute monarch. It's, you know, a form of government that would be considered absolutism. That's what it is. You know, there's a lot of words in world history that unfortunately all more or less mean the same thing. Over time, most European nations had gradually limited the power of monarchs. However, by the early 1900s, Russian czars continued absolute rule without being controlled by a constitution. For those of you guys that came in late, we were making a cause and effect chart of the Russian Revolution. So most of the notes you're going to see leading up to the revolution are going to be causes. Obviously, once the revolution starts, everything needs to be in effect. So, you know, you get into the 20th century, you know, when Russia ultimately goes through this big transition. You know, Europe had already been through a lot. You know, they went through the Protestant Reformation, where all of a sudden religion is still a big deal, but it's not as unifying and powerful a force as it has once been, as you get different forms of Christianity. You had the Renaissance, this sort of rediscovery of lost Greek and Roman ideals, including ideas about representative government. You had the Enlightenment, that big shift in political thought where, yeah, people were saying, nah, rulers don't get their power from God. Rulers get their power from the people, and people deserve some representation. All that stuff never really gets to Russia. And it's something I've said before. Russia historically, you know, especially leading into the 20th century, they lag a little bit behind their European neighbors. I mean, Russia geographically, mainly in Asia, culturally, though, mainly European-based, but still doesn't mean they're at the exact same rate of development. That is a theme that's going to help lead to their downfall. Russia's always lagging a little bit behind. And as far as people's rights, as far as the power of government, by the early 20th century, I mean, it's pretty much how it had always been. The czar can do whatever he wants, and the people have very few guaranteed rights. Russia also lagged behind the rest of Europe in social and economic development. Bless you. The Industrial Revolution, like everything else, came a little bit later to Russia. By 1900, Russia's economy was still mainly based on agriculture, and for most of its history, there were really just two main social classes. You had the serfs, which was the majority, peasants who had very few rights that literally belonged to the land of noblemen, and then you have the noblemen. In Russia, they were called the boyars. Approximately 20% of the population were nobles. They controlled the majority of the empire's wealth and land, whereas the majority of the people were considered serfs. These people lived in extreme poverty, were bound to the land owned by the nobility, and had very few rights. In contrast, Russia's czars owned numerous palaces and lived in luxuries. So the disparity between rich and poor was extremely high in Russia for most of its history. Try to think back to when we watched that Engineering and Empire. You saw like, the Winter Palace with 1,000 rooms in it and different golden statues and fountains. And I mean, it's not just that, there were very few rich people and a whole lot of poor people. It's that the rich were insanely rich and the poor were almost equally insanely poor. That's the big divide. That's the big gap for most of Russia's history. So it kind of makes sense later on once you get to the 20th century and there is this revolution. You're talking about a population of people that for most of their history has been historically poor, at least most people. Communism is going to sound very appealing to them. A classless society. That is the goal. I mean, that's the whole premise of communism. Well, now we're not going to have any rich. We're not going to have any poor. We're all going to be equal. We're going to work together for the betterment of society. Now, we know that it doesn't really turn out that way, but when you look at their historical background, you can kind of see why, promises of communism, finally promises of equality, might be appealing to these people. Okay, Russia, when it becomes the Soviet Union, is going to be the world's first country to become communist, or at least attempt to do so. True communism, you could argue, has never really existed. Although serfdom was abolished in 1861, life for most Russian peasants didn't improve a whole lot. Extreme poverty was still an issue for most of the people, and over time, Russia did begin to modernize. Peasants who moved to the cities to work in Russia's developing industry saved for a better life. Opportunities for new business owners and educated professionals increased. Eventually, a new middle class emerged. However, the Tsar still held absolute power. Like the nation's wealthy nobility had begun to feel, the newly created middle class was upset that the people had no voice in government. Combined with the discontent of millions of poor, peasants, and urban workers, this situation made Russia ripe for revolution. So serfdom, and serfs have been a part of Russian life for like forever. It ends in 1861. And I mean, that's a time period where, serfdom and slavery and a lot of those forced labor systems or coerced labor systems were starting to fade out. So you no longer have serfdom, but for most people, they still remain very poor. Now, there are more opportunities moving forward. By the mid-1800s, Russia does industrialize to a certain extent. But still, a lot of people are struggling. The people in the cities have more opportunities, more ideas, more and more options for jobs. You do see a middle class emerge. Things are getting better for some, but not for all. But as you get, more opportunities, people are going to become a little bit more knowledgeable. They're going to become more educated. And they saw what was going on elsewhere in the world. They saw what was going on in Europe and in the United States, and they wanted a little bit more representation as well. Because again, even though changes are coming, the government's still essentially the same. The Tsar has absolute power. Things came to a head while Russia was being defeated in the Russo-Japanese War. Russia went to a war with Japan over territory, and Japan actually won, even though it was way smaller. Japan industrialized earlier. They built a pretty strong military, and again, they were able to defeat the much larger Russia because of their technological superiority. At this point, Russia is industrialized, but maybe not to the level of some of the other powers. Again, it falls into that theme of Russia being a little bit behind for much of its history. So things are tense. They just lost a war. The government's becoming less and less popular. So citizens did what a lot of other citizens have done throughout history. They protest. They organize a petition. They're demanding an end to the war. They're demanding fairer wages. They're demanding voting rights. They actually march on the Tsar's palace, hoping to deliver this petition to him. Now, at this point, we've got Tsar Nicholas II, who just happens to be the last Tsar. And he could have went out and negotiated with him. He could have talked to him, but he is a czar. He wields unlimited power. He's not used to having his authority questioned. So that's not what he does. What he does results in what becomes known as Bloody Sunday. January 1905, government troops fire on unarmed protesters who were trying to present a petition to the Tsar. He has his own people shot. You're going to see from here leading forward, the government, particularly Tsar Nicholas II, is going to get less and less popular. Things are going to really strain the relationship. And ultimately, it's going to lead to a full-on political revolution. It is estimated that close to 1,000 citizens were killed or wounded. Uprisings broke out across the country. Peasants seized land. Workers protested, went on strike. Some called this the 1905 revolution. In response, Tsar Nicholas II granted limited reforms. I mean, he didn't have much of a choice. I mean, this was bordering on full-on revolution. He thought that his power and his family may be, in peril, serious jeopardy. He never faced anything like this before. So he does give in to some of the demands. He grants limited reforms, creating an elected legislature, the Duma, essentially Russian parliament. So now there's going to be a sort of branch of government that is representative. However, only the wealthiest citizens were actually allowed to vote. And he still more or less retained unlimited power. So a lot of the reforms he granted, they look good on the surface, but when you dig into them, they're really not much in the way of reforms at all. Years later, though, not that many years later, about 9 years later, well, now you got another situation that's going to make the Tsar more unpopular, and it's going to kind of strain the relationship between the people and the government, the outbreak of World War I. Although social improvements were made in the years following Bloody Sunday, Russia was not prepared for the hardships of World War I. As a member of European alliances, Tsar Nicholas II brought Russia into World War I in 1914, fighting against Austria-Hungary and Germany. Due to poor training, outdated weaponry, and inferior equipment, Russia suffered heavy losses throughout World War I. The war became extremely unpopular with Russia's soldiers and its citizens. Additionally, due in part to the war effort, there were massive food shortages in Russia. Man, it's like a recipe for revolution. Everything's just falling in line. He's already unpopular. He's already kind of faced the wrath of his people. Now they're getting pulled into a war that they're only involved in because they're allies with Serbia. They, while industrialized, their military is not to the level of Germany. Okay, Germany was by far the largest and most technologically advanced military of the day. They don't have all the things that the Russians have. They are behind. They don't even have all the transportation. I mean, a lot of the soldiers are still riding horses into battle. Just imagine that, carrying inferior firearms. They had a very large military, but technologically they were behind. And as we saw at the end of World War I, at the very end, Russia had more casualties than anybody else. So you've got this unpopular czar involved in an unpopular war. And because of the unpopular war, now there's not enough food for people to eat at home. It's a recipe for disaster. Here we have Tsar Nicholas and his family. He had 4 daughters, 1 son. The son's name was Alexei. The wife's name was Alexandria. One of his daughters becomes kind of famous. Her name is Anastasia. Have you guys ever seen the old animated classic Anastasia? All right, that was one of his daughters. I think it was his youngest daughter. I could be mistaken, though. I forget which one she is. Now, the Tsar's wife, and we're kind of backtracking a little bit because he had been married, obviously, for quite a while. The Tsar's wife was unpopular from the get-go almost, and especially unpopular when World War One started, because the Tsar's wife is not from Russia. Can anybody guess where she's from? She's from Germany. So you've got an unpopular German wife of an unpopular Tsar during a war against Germany. So you can kind of see why people wouldn't trust her. This gets exacerbated by her relationship and the family's relationship with a very notorious historic individual, Grigory Rasputin. I mean, just look at this guy. He looks scandalous. Rasputin was a reported holy man, spiritual healer. Some thought he had magical powers, that he could hypnotize people, that he could cure people of diseases. They brought him in because the Tsar's only male child, Alexei, he was sick. He had hemophilia, which when you have hemophilia, if you get even a minor injury, you could bleed to death. It's like an inability for your blood to clot. Well, he had been sick, quite a bit when he was a kid, and he's the only male heir, so they were very protective of him. And word starts to spread about this guy, Rasputin. And the Tsarina calls him in, and he starts hanging out with the kid, and the kid feels better. The kid does better. People thought it was magic. People thought that he had some special powers. He had for years been wandering Russia, saying that he had prophetic dreams, he could see the future, that he had these magical healing powers, that he was a holy man. Some people, though, thought he was the devil. He was reportedly involved in cult activities. He was very scandalous. He was a womanizer, let's just say that. Had relationships with a lot of women, a ridiculous amount, including a lot of married women. He drank a lot. He may have used drugs. He didn't bathe. He reportedly just stank to high heaven, but he somehow gained this sort of power over the family. And a lot of it had to do with the effect that he had on Alexei. And supposedly he just demanded that the doctor stop giving Alexei aspirin, which at the time they thought was like a miracle drug. Well, it also turns out it's a blood thinner. And for somebody with hemophilia, it's not good for him. Probably stopping taking the aspirin is what made him feel better. But to the Tsarina, I mean, this was going to be her right-hand man. This is who healed her son. So this guy gains quite a notorious reputation, having relationships with married women, having relationships with prostitutes, having relationships with anyone that he could. And really because he's got the ear of the royal family, a lot of the nobility start to hate him as well. People try to kill him. One time he returns back home to Siberia, and this random woman stabs him in the stomach. Reportedly even tries to pull his guts out. He survives. He goes back home. But pretty soon, there's a plot. We got to get rid of Rasputin, because in the public eye, he was seen as this evil puppet master. So one night, this plot kind of hatches. It had been hatching for a while. And I think the main perpetrator is the Tsar's nephew. So he's a member of the royal family. Him and a bunch of his buddies and a bunch of members of the Duma, some of the elites of Russian society, they decide Rasputin's got to go. Because again, we're already in this war and things are going bad. And one of the things the public is really against is this freak, got to get rid of him. Now it gets kind of dicey here, but this is an interesting story. There's a lot of varying reports. But supposedly they lure Rasputin to this party. They say there's going to be a lot of women, there's going to be a bunch of booze, all things that Rasputin is into. And he goes in, and it's the Tsar's nephew and a bunch of his buddies, and they got all this lavish food out, and they've got wine and stuff. And they're like, man, eat, drink, have a good time. Little as Rasputin know, everything there has so much cyanide in it, it would kill a horse. So Rasputin goes to town, and he's eating, and he's drinking, and he's drinking, and he's drinking. And these guys are standing around watching him, and, he drinks one cup of wine, he drinks several cups of wine, he eats his fill. Hours go by, and this guy is not dead. It's not even fading. So here's the story, and some of this is legend, so take it with a grain of salt. Apparently, the Tsar's nephew gets sick of it. He goes and grabs a pistol and shoots him in the chest. Supposedly shoots him in the heart. Supposedly. Maybe he just thought he did. Who knows? Rasputin collapses. Boom. Dead. Over. These guys go in the other room. They start celebrating. They start drinking, all that stuff. But the Tsar's nephew's kind of paranoid. He's like, this Rasputin, he's got magic. He's got magical powers. I don't know. Is he really dead? So supposedly they go in there, and Rasputin leaps up and starts fighting, starts punching them all, right? So they shoot him a few more times, and they start beating him with rods, and they start beating him over the head, and they beat the crap out of this guy, shoot him several more times, even shoot him in the head. Then they drag him to a local river. This is Russia. It's the middle of winter, so it's frozen, but there's a little fishing hole, and they dump his body in. But according to the Tsar's nephew, as they dumped his body in, he's screaming all the way as he floats under the ice. That he wasn't even dead then. So who knows? Weird character, right? But he's dead. He's gone. People are hoping that maybe that'll kind of help to restore people's faith in the monarchy, but it didn't. It's just more of a side story that's kind of interesting. Nicholas II, it is worth noting, is the last Russian Tsar. In February of 1917, because, killing Rasputin didn't fix things, worker-led food riots broke out in cities across Russia. Historically, when the people are hungry, that's when things get set off. When soldiers refused to fire on striking workers, Tsar Nicholas II realized he was powerless to govern the nation, and he gave up his throne. The Duma declared Russia a republic. However, this new provisional government failed to win the support of the people when they initially refused to withdraw from World War I. This is the first phase of the revolution, the February Revolution I talked about. So the Tsar's out, okay? He's not in charge anymore. They go kind of put him into house arrest. He goes, lives in one of his palaces. It's not that bad, but he's not in charge anymore. Now the Duma's in charge, but they don't immediately pull out of World War I. They want to fulfill Russia's obligations to their allies. Well, that's okay for them, but immediately they lose the faith of the people because that's one of the main things that the people were against, the war itself. Vying for political power outside the Duma were several groups of what were called Soviets, workers and soldiers led by socialists. These socialists promised reforms such as land redistribution and better opportunities for education. Another revolution was bound to happen because, again, the people weren't happy. Yes, sir. Go ahead. In comes this guy who's going to be pretty important to world history, Vladimir Lenin. He was a follower of Karl Marx. He lived in exile in Sweden. He had been run off years earlier because he was a troublemaker. Reportedly, the Germans secretly sent him back to Russia by railroad, hoping he would cause further unrest in Russia, allowing Germany to shift focus away from Russia during World War I. Again, at this point, the Tsar's been overthrown. But, man, Russia's still in the war. So the Germans go find this guy. This guy who is a Russian, who had followers there, who had been seen as a troublemaker, who had been an enemy of the Tsar before and the government in general. They give him a bunch of money. They sneak him back into Russia, and they're hoping he does what he does, cause problems. Problems that hopefully will be enough to get Russia finally out of the war so the Germans don't have to worry about Russia anymore. Lenin comes back and quickly gains followers by promoting communism, a radical form of socialism which focused on common ownership of all property and ideally, an emphasis on leading to a classless society. No rich or poor, which we had already said, would be very appealing to a population that historically had been very poor. Lenin's supporters, known as the Bolsheviks, that's a really important term to know, Bolsheviks. They're the ones that kind of usher in communism to Russia. They had kind of like a campaign promise almost. Their promise, peace, bread, and land. That's the rallying cry. You help put us in power. We're going to give you peace. We're going to pull out of World War I. That's what you want. We're going to give it to you. You guys are starving, so we're going to feed you. We're going to give you bread. I mean, food in general, but bread, it's a better slogan. And ultimately, you know how, the rich own just about everything. We are going to redistribute the land. We're going to make things a little bit more equal for people. Again, that's what communism is all about. Ideally, equality. And the people start to eat that up. Peace to the soldiers, bread to the hungry, land to the peasants. The Bolsheviks seized power by force in the Second Revolution in October of 1917. The October Revolution, however, years of civil war would follow. Again, there's still people loyal to the Tsar. There's still people loyal to the Duma. There's still, a lot of division. But they do seize power in October, and they, after defeating their enemies, never really give it up. Once in power, Vladimir Lenin and the Communist Party immediately withdrew the country from World War I. And that's when Russia actually pulls out. Again, there's another year or so of the war left. But this is definitely something that Germany was hoping for. Unfortunately, when the United States comes in and kind of takes Russia's place, I mean, it turns out ultimately in the end not helping them that much. And again, we got some propaganda here of the communists kind of being victorious and, taking over. Now, the new leader is going to be this Vladimir Lenin. He's kind of the father of the Soviet Union. But he had two right-hand men, if you will, or let's say a right-hand man and a left-hand man. And they are here in order. You've got Vladimir Lenin in the center. You've got a guy named Leon Trotsky over here on the right-hand side. You probably haven't heard of him, but he's going to be a big deal later on. And then you've got someone who's very notorious, who will be the next leader of the Soviet Union once Vladimir Lenin dies, the leader of the Soviet Union during World War II, and a little bit after, Joseph Stalin. Have you guys heard of Joseph Stalin? He's on about the same level as Hitler. Actually probably caused way more death than Hitler. We'll get into that a little bit later, but he is a very, very bad man. The Bolsheviks' political party soon were referred to as simply the Communist Party. In 1922, this is a little bit after the war, because again, there's years of civil war that have to be fought. The name of the Russian Empire changes to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, aka the USSR, or the Soviet Union for short. You look at the flag, and I think I mentioned this before. I mean, this becomes kind of a symbol for communism, but it is the flag of the Soviet Union. You've got the hammer, you've got the sickle. Because again, it's all about the workers, overthrowing the capitalists, the business owners, and establishing something new, something more equal, at least ideally. Russia had become the world's first communist country with Vladimir Lenin as its new absolute leader. Russia will be the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1991. Really not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. I remember when it shifted back to being Russia. It was the Soviet Union for most of my childhood. Lenin added his own ideas to Karl Marx's original theory of communism. He argued that after the revolution, a temporary dictatorship was needed because the workers brought up in a capitalist society could not be trusted to know their true best interests. In reality, the Soviet Union would be ruled by totalitarian dictators until it dissolved in the 1990s. And that's kind of the irony of it. Part of this was replacing an autocratic an autocratic leader in the Tsar, and having something more representative. But ultimately, they replaced an absolute monarch with a dictator. Okay, so the power of government doesn't decrease. In some ways, it increases because now the government's going to be in charge of everything, including the economy. And ultimately, a lot of people are going to suffer under this. They transferred millions of acres to the peasants, and workers were organized and operated all factories. The government also nationalized or took over all of the country's major industries. After defeating the last supporters of the Tsar, Lenin had Nicholas II and his family murdered to ensure the monarchy can never be restored, securing the power of the new communist government. So this is kind of, towards the end of the big civil war, and Lenin's in charge, but there's still some supporters of the Tsar out there. And the story goes that, Lenin, the Bolsheviks, they had the royal family moved around, to try to keep them out of the hands of their supporters. But, some of the supporters were kind of closing in. So in the middle of the night, soldiers enter the family's home, and they round up the whole family, and they march them down into the basement, and they shoot them all in the head. Now, years later, maybe it's just the hope that one of them survived. Who really knows? But years later, there were several women roaming around Europe who claimed to be one of the Tsar's daughters, Anastasia. They were all frauds. I mean, she died. But you look back at like the Disney movie, that's kind of what it's based on. The rumors that maybe she did live. She died. They conclusively proved that a few years ago. They finally found her body and did DNA tests and stuff like that. Obviously, that's stuff they couldn't do in the 1920s and 30s when these ladies were active. But that's kind of how she becomes famous, more so because there were people claiming to be her rather than anyone that actually was her. And you will have the Soviet Union in power all the way up until the 1990s. Now, we're going to watch a little video that's going to go over a lot of the same stuff. It's going to take pretty much right to the bell, but I think this is good because it'll give you a more clear picture of some of the little details that maybe we left out. Obviously, I tried to give you the simplified version. This is going to go a little bit more detailed, but I think it'll kind of help you understand how all this went down. So watch, pay attention. You don't necessarily have to take any notes. And here we go. Actually, fast, man.